Welcome back to The Big Show. It's Alex Belfield talking to the biggest stars, and my next guest is a man who I've watched on TV for as long as I can remember. He started on the radio. He's got a brand new book out celebrating his life. He's the one and only Denis Norden. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Yes, thank you for inviting me on.
Thanks so much for sparing the time to talk to us today, because it must be great to be you, because everybody knows you, don't they?
I'm not one of those faces that is universally recognised. I don't know why it is. And I don't, immediately have people rushing up and saying, will you sign this? They seem to vaguely place me as someone they've had in their front room without quite locating it on the television. So I've had people come up and saying, weren't you Millie's boy? And then somebody asked me if their dry cleaning was ready, So you do have a sort of a one remove familiarity.
And you have a tremendous voice and a way of speaking that's completely unique. Have you always had that? Were you born with it?
Yeah, well, that's strange because you don't hear your own voice because you're inside it. So it doesn't seem to me in any way individual, never has.
Let's go right back to the beginning, because I've been reading all about you and your bio, and you've got this new book out, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And what a fascinating start it was. What made you the star you are today? Was it the army or was it the radio?
I started as a cinema manager, in the days when cinemas are not the kind of East German interrogation blocks that they look like today, when they were really palaces, and we showed 2 feature films and a stage show and a newsreel and a cartoon and organ interlude and trailers, and you got all that for 6 months, 4 hours of entertainment. So that's where I started writing. I actually started writing the text for cinema organ interludes. Now, the cinema organ is not often heard in the land these days. People tend to, quite a lot of people, loathe it. But back then, and I'm talking, 1939, 1940, it was the loudest musical instrument around. It was the loudest noise people heard that had any kind of music in it. And they were very popular and enjoyed regular radio broadcasts. And back then, the organ interludes, as they were called, were about 15 minutes, anything between 7 and 15 minutes long, and they were illustrated by slides. The theme of each one every week was illustrated by slides. And I started writing by writing text for cinema organ slides. Now, not many practitioners of that particular art still around, actually, but it is a kind of screenwriting because they were projected on a screen, and they were either about some theme, gems from Albert Catelby or something, or more usually they were what used to be called community singing, what are now called sing-alongs, and I would write parodies of the popular songs of the day. And so that was the first time I'd essayed comedy writing. It was the first time I heard audiences laughing at something I'd made up.
Did you always have a funny bone then? Were you always able to see the funny side of life?
I don't know. It's very difficult that to answer. I think you're very much conditioned physically. I mean, I was 6 foot 2 3/4 when I was 13, so my body was because it was a generation when people weren't as tall as they are today. It's very noticeable. So I spent most of my teenage and early years in the form of a question mark to kind of diminish my height. And I suppose that is something that makes you take a somewhat oblique look at things. I was never a comedian. I was in the RAF, actually, and to establish concert parties or reviews or whatever to strengthen the troops' morale. I don't know what. So I volunteered to write for one of those shows. One of our earliest auditionees was a mill hand from Oldham called Eric Sykes. So I started, as it were, with a strong cast to write for, and I never had any intention of being a performer. I don't think I ever was a performer, actually, but I soon found out that if I wrote the shows, I stayed back at headquarters while these concert parties, reviews, went out and toured all round and had a whale of a time. So I then started to write in little bits for myself to get off guard duty. And, and then after the war, there was radio. We all came out. There was a whole generation that came out. There was Eric Sykes, and Spike Milligan, and Bob Monkhouse, and there was a period around about the 70s or 80s when I got into writing for conferences. A lot of conferences took place. They were wonderful for writers, comedy writers, because they spent thousands on putting on these shows to motivate their sales staff and so on. And if you wrote something that rhymed, they thought it was genius, you see. So we milked that for all we were worth. I remember I was writing one for IBM, and I'd written a lot of sketches in this particular show, and the marketing director got cold feet about it on the night before the thing was supposed to be shown to this vast multinational sales staff, and he said to me, "Are you sure this is funny?" And I said to him, if I could be sure something was funny, IBM would be working for me. So you really don't know. All comedy is a risk venture. There's no way you can make it otherwise.
And you have to look at the world from a different perspective. How do you know that it's going to tickle people's funny bone? And what do you see in your mind that makes it different and stick out?
You're really probing very deep, Alex. And I'm squirming a bit here because I don't know. Somebody once said that trying to analyze comedy is like dissecting a rabbit. You can find out how the inside works, but the thing dies in the process. So I think all writers are a bit timid about trying to go too deep to find out how it happens, because if they finally find it, it'll stop happening. We always used to say, when people used to say to us, these kind of probing philosophical questions that you all were to ask, obviously. What is comedy? The chief end of comedy is to make people merry. And we would then add another quotation that we attributed to Victor Hugo, which is, "The world needs more merry people and less miserables."
And let's talk about comedians generally, because nobody knows comedy more than you. Who was the funniest comedian ever?
Oh, yeah. And you want to know what is the purpose of life while we're at? Who was the funniest comedian ever? I think as funny as anybody, and I make this book, in the book, Clips from a Life, I would award the palm to a man called Bud Flanagan. You see, the trouble is these people are not preserved. Another marvellous comedian was Syd Field. Now, he exists on film in two films, London Town and Cardboard Cavalier, neither of which do him any justice at all. It's as though his performance has an embalmed quality to it. But he was the man who reached out to audiences. And how do you judge who was the funniest comedian ever? By the contentment and happiness on an audience's face as they come out of the theatre and so on. He did the most for audiences who paid to see him of anybody that I ever came across.
And there's a difference between the cleverest and the funniest, isn't there? I think probably Bob Monkhouse would be in the cleverest, because he was such a quick man.
Bob was possibly the best technician of humour that I ever came across. There was nothing that he couldn't do absolutely in a first-rate manner, but he wasn't in himself funny. He was a marvellous writer. In fact, towards the end of his days, we used to have a thing. He was trying to find what he called the ultimate joke. That is, to write a joke that is so funny that once you've heard it, you never need to hear another joke. If you want to laugh, you just think back to this joke. That'll do for the rest of your life, you see. In the last couple of years of life, whenever we met, I would say to him, "How are you getting on with the ultimate joke?" And the last thing he told me, he says, "I've got the first line of it," which is, "A man went into a chemist's shop.
And when you are a writer, help me with this, because most people in show business have a massive ego. You have to be the most selfless guy in the world to offer your material to somebody else for them to get the glory and nobody knows your name.
We used to call ourselves comedians labourers. Our job was A, to do jokes that would fit them, and B, to find the type of humour that they didn't know they were able to perform, make them perform it, and from that there is an extra satisfaction, which I suppose matches the satisfaction of a performer when he sees an audience rolling about.
Now, let's talk about the new book, which basically has got all your best bits in it. It's called Clips from a Life. Clever title, because, of course, everybody knows you from those clip shows lately, don't they?
I didn't want to write the usual sort of from I was born of poor but humble, you know, that sort of thing. So I just sat down and wrote down my recollection of anything that had particularly impressed or interested or amused me during the course of my working life. You see, it's a kind of a work, and I made a kind of worksheet which went from the very first thing I wrote, you know, and was connected with right the way through to the last "it'll be all right on the night" type of thing, and then it came out as something like 250 or 60 disconnected bits of text or prose, and it was so much like the clips that we used to get in, which used to arrive in this sort of disordered, jumbled, non-chronological form, that I called it Clips from a Life. We had it assembled in some kind of vaguely chronological order, though I'm pleased to say that it is one of the rare books where my childhood is only chronicled in the last chapter.
Reading your book made me want to live your life, because you've been so lucky to have worked with so many people and done so much.
Yeah, I have a thing about nostalgia. I did for 14 years for Thames Television a nostalgia series called Looks Familiar, in which specialised, was located in nostalgia for the 30s and 40s. Nostalgia, I tend to resent when it takes a form of regret. You know, things were much better then than they are now. As you say, the fun that I had, the things that suddenly brought me up short, the first time I encountered anything, from the first time, you know, encountered comedians, the first time I encountered avocado pears, for example. Well, I can recall the first time Marks and Spencer stocked avocado pear, and nobody knew what to do with them, you know. And so they sold them with a little pamphlet, and they recommended that what you do is you cut them in half, take the stone out, and fill the holes with dry sherry. Because I go back to days when there was only one Chinese restaurant in London that I knew. I mean, apart from Limehouse, but in the West End, there was a Chinese restaurant in Wardour Street, and nobody else had ever. And so that I remember thinking to myself, if my parents ever heard us say something like, "I'm going out for a Chinese," they wouldn't know what we were talking about.
What was the funniest line you ever wrote, and the line that you're most proud of?
We wrote a line as the funniest line in movies, and we actually wrote it. It was borrowed from us by Talbot Rothwell, who wrote the Carry On films, because we had originally written it for a sketch in Take It From Here, which was a radio series that Frank and I wrote. Jimmy Edwards, as a historical character, complaining of how he'd met with treachery, and he said, infamy, they've all got it in for me. Now that was then said by Kenneth Williams in a Carry On film, and was got an award of some kind as the funniest line. For us, the funniest line in movies ever, which we didn't write, was written by Val Guest for a film called Oh, Mr. Porter, for a comedian called Will Hay, in which he played the part of a station master who took over. It was an adaptation of a play called The Ghost Train, and he comes to this deserted railway station, all run down and unkempt, and absolutely nobody about. Goes onto the platform. There's a closed ticket window, and he knocks on it, and the face an actor called Moore Marriott, who played a very elderly man with wisps of white hair and only one tooth in his mouth, who lifted up the shutters and said, "Next train's gone." And now, that's the best comedy in 3 words that we ever came across.
And does comedy work as well visually for you as it does on the radio? Because there's still something very special about radio comedy, isn't there?
Well, you know, the thing that they call radio the theatre of the mind, and people saying they prefer radio plays to television plays because the costumes and the scenery are better. You know, that I think every writer who writes from both mediums prefers radio to television, because your radio is a kind of dialogue. You supply half of the experience. You supply what goes in people's ears, then they clothe it in their minds. So it is, in that sense, you're working with the audience. Television tends to be more of a monologue. You put it in front of them, and that's what it is, you know. So I'm of a generation, we were very verbally oriented, and we tend to admire people who do physical comedy, like, as I say, Syd Field, Max Wall, that type of person.
Well, you retired a couple of years ago, and here you are back with this book, and congratulations to you on it. It's a fantastic insight into your life and into your history, and what a life you've had. It's just so fascinating, the people you've written for and the people you've worked with. And then, of course, this new generation is still watching you on YouTube with It'll Be All Right on the Night.
I like doing It'll Be All Right on the Night. I love the idea of this going on YouTube, just blithely putting these clips on. If you knew how many clearances we had to do to get the people in those before we could put them in the show or on the screen, and now YouTube blithely puts it on without it, you know, having to ask anybody's permission at any time.
And nobody gets paid, do they?
Nobody gets paid. In It'll Be All Right on that, everybody got paid. All the actors who made mistakes, we would ask them, can we show this clip, this outtake of you making a mistake? If they said yes, they got paid a fee. If the program was repeated, they got paid another fee. If that particular clip was borrowed for an overseas version of It'll Be All Right on the Night, because it wound up with every country in the world doing their own version of it, they get paid again and again and again. And we used to say it was like a farm where the farmer earns more from the manure than from the cattle. You know?
And of course, the 2 things we know you for from that show was the clipboard and your delivery of what you read out. Was the clipboard just because you needed notes, or was it there to be your catchphrase, if you like?
No, my clipboard. It was a question I was most frequently asked. What is written on the clipboard? Why do you hold the clipboard? When we recorded It'll Be All Right on the Night, we used to record it in 3 pieces, you know, because of having to put the commercials in. And I used to ask the audience during the breaks, you know, is there anything you'd like to know? And invariably they say, why do you always carry the clipboard? And I used to tell them the honest truth. It's because I'm not a natural performer, and I never know what to do with my hands. And I said this one week, and somebody from the audience shouted out, you ever thought of putting them over your mouth?
Congratulations on being you. Thank you again for writing the book. It's a real insight into your life. It's called Clips from a Life, and Denis Norden is the author. And thank you for talking to us on the programme.
Thank you, Alex.